Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our session, All the Things to Renew or Not Renew a Read and Publish Agreement. I'm Maureen Walsh, Scholarly Sharing Strategist with the Ohio State University Libraries. I'm joined by Kelly O'Rourke, Head of Commercial Transformation, Open Research, Cambridge University Press, Amy Pulowski, Executive Director, OhioLink, and Matthew Wilmot, Assistant Director for Open Access Agreements, California Digital Library. Many libraries have entered into read and publish agreements. In North America, we are now in a period where those first or second agreements are expiring and are up for renewal. How do libraries, consortia, and publishers approach potential renewals? How do stakeholders assess the impact and outcomes of read and publish agreements? What have we collectively learned, and how do those lessons affect negotiations for the next agreement? What is the tipping point for renewal or walking away? Our speakers will share their perspectives on how they evaluate and frame return on investment for read and publish agreements. This session will begin with brief context setting and features a dialogue between myself and our panelists on the opportunities and challenges of deciding to renew or not renew a read and publish agreement. The QR code is to the Code of Conduct, a reminder the Charleston Library Conference is an inclusive conference. And a reminder to use a microphone and to identify yourselves by name and affiliation when asking questions. Amy? Your first slide.
Just making sure my numbers are right. I'm just thinking. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I know it's Thursday at 5 o'clock, so it's so nice to see. I walked in and I thought, oh, it's Wednesday? Oh. I got 2 more days, friends. Really quickly about OhioLink, some information and data about our makeup, but we're more or less every higher education nonprofit institution in the state of Ohio. So when we're looking at deals, I have to try to make sure that it makes sense for community colleges all the way up to the Ohio State University. Just to give you an idea of some of our output, I'm going to have to turn around and look. We can go to the next slide. We started doing some OA deals in 2022. We started with Cambridge and Wiley, and then slowly built up to 5 deals over the years. And this is just a sense of our output. So it is growing, it's popular. I think we'll hear throughout the session that once faculty members and researchers start finding out that this is out there, that they do try to take advantage of it.
The Ohio State University Libraries started planning and negotiating its first read and publish agreement in 2019 at the beginning of a library's strategic initiative that focused on expanding avenues of open access, extending read access to content, and supporting authors' rights. At the foundation of our work in this space is making the research and scholarship of Ohio State's faculty, staff, and students openly available while continuing strong stewardship of Ohio State's financial resources. Fast forward 7 years, and in addition to supporting Diamond Open Access, Subscribe to Open, and Open Scholarly Infrastructure, we have 13 read and publish agreements and 1 pure publish agreement. Of the read and publish, 5 are with OhioLink and 2 are with the Big Ten Academic Alliance. Since our first agreement in 2020 with Taylor and Francis, our open access agreements have waived more than $13.9 million in open access article fees for Ohio State corresponding authors. 5 of our current read and publish agreements have an end date of December 31st, including our second 3-year agreement with Taylor and Francis, and 2 that are with consortia. As of today, Ohio State has renewed 1 of the 5 with a company of biologists. The others are in discussion. Matthew?
Hi. Like Maureen said, I'm Matt Wilmot. I'm the Assistant Director for Open Access Agreements at the California Digital Library. CDL is part of the University of California system, and among other things, we handle negotiation and administration of system-wide licensed resources on behalf of the 10 campuses of the system. For the last 10 years or so, driven by guidance from our faculty and other administrative groups across UC, CDL has placed a high priority on negotiating agreements which redirect our sizable subscription investments to instead support open access publishing for UC authors. So at present, we have about 20 such negotiated agreements with publishers that offer explicit support for immediate, direct open access publishing for UC researchers, covering just over half of all journal articles coming out of the UC system.
Kelly.
All right, finally, I'm Kelly from Cambridge. So at Cambridge, we have committed to shifting our journals list to majority open. And this for us is very much tied to our mission as a publisher. We believe that majority open access is the best way for us to support our mission to deliver the greatest possible impact for research. It was in 2017 that we signed our first read and publish deal in the Netherlands, and at that point, Cambridge Research was only 7% OA. Our first transformative agreement in the US was with CDL, with the University of California system in 2019. And between 2020 and 2022, most of our consortium deals in the US shifted from a full read collection to a TA. We were really proactive about that, and it was really thrilling to see the reception from US libraries and consortia during that time period. So as of the end of 2024, 68% of our research was open, and that was really primarily driven by our transformative agreement program and TA footprint, which is now over 2,600 institutions globally. And looking ahead to 2026, for the first time, just over half of our titles will be open access journals come 2026. So that transformation is really happening on a journal title level as well. The final point I just want to make is that we work within an incredibly diverse context. Over half of our journals are published on behalf of scholarly societies, and our list covers both the humanities, social sciences, as well as science, tech, and medicine.
Thank you. All of us on this panel are stakeholders in the renewal or non-renewal of read and publish agreements, and we each bring different perspectives to the table. I'm going to ask a series of questions of our panelists to try and unpack the opportunities and challenges of deciding to renew or not renew a read and publish agreement. In the current landscape of uncertainty across higher education, what budgetary and value levers are at play in the read and publish space? Another way of framing it, looking back at your first read and publish agreements to the ones you are negotiating or considering now, what has changed? What does values-driven mean today with increasing budgetary constraints? Has focus shifted? Matthew, how are you framing your priorities today, and do you see that framing shifting over the next few years?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the space because of budget constraints. And while I'd argue that our values haven't really changed, it would be foolish to think our overall approach hasn't been affected. I think we're not alone in that we're in the space of considering canceling agreements to meet budget challenges, and it can't possibly be the case that our OA agreements, which now comprise half of our ongoing spend, are immune to that consideration or to added budget pressures. So I think what it means is that when renewing our agreements, it puts extra focus on the financial model and making sure that it's something we can afford in the short term. That focus has always been there, right? We're not writing blank checks here, but it's now a critical need, and so it tends to get more emphasis in the discussions. It's also important to note that it's not just libraries that are experiencing funding challenges, though. It's the whole university system. We think this is likely to mean a decrease in research output in the coming years. Less investment in research means fewer researchers producing fewer outputs. Many of our agreements have some cost variability based on the volume of publishing services that the publisher offers us. So less publishing may result in less cost, although that's subject to some complex controls, so it's not always a given. But that's a feature of our agreement, not a bug. It keeps us and our investment connected and responsive to the research process more directly. And it also means that when we're negotiating a renewal, that we have to shift our expectations for what the next 3 years will look like for a given publisher. As for how that's shifting over the next few years, I think it's hard to say. We'll largely need to be responsive to our research communities here, but there's so much uncertainty right now that we can't really predict. That's maybe another feature of the model, though. Our investments follow what our researchers are doing with their work. And so we'll be constantly observing what's happening and trying to stay as aligned as possible within the budget constraints that are a reality for us over the next few years.
Amy, how is OhioLink navigating change and preparing for continued uncertainty? Are you seeing a shift in how you approach open access agreements or in the offers you see from publishers?
So OhioLink has been doing large data gathering projects since we stepped into all of these deals. And initially, we started data gathering to make sure there was no double dipping. I'm looking at Gwen in the audience because we remember when we were thinking about that? So we are looking very closely at how much is coming out on the subscription side, that we're getting the same amount of articles out of the subscription side if that cost is not going down, and comparing that to what is happening in open. We do this every year now. We were doing it every 2 years. We do this every year now to take a look at that. One thing, Matthew set the table nicely with what is going on and how do we plan for uncertainty that I don't know. But I will take a look at the data. Something we've been thinking about recently is the point of saturation. So we have so many researchers that have so much time within a given year, then conceivably can only do so much output. So the deals are growing and we're seeing it become more popular and more researchers participating, but at what point are they reaching saturation? They've produced as much as they can produce, and making sure we're keeping our eye on that.
Thank you. Kelly, what changes are you seeing across the landscape that may affect Cambridge University Press's open access agreements? How are you preparing for the near future, and how does that affect your strategic priorities?
So thinking about when libraries were starting to join TAs with Cambridge around 5 or 6 years ago in the US, things kind of felt a little bit more experimental and kind of lower stakes. There's sort of a sense of, let's see where this goes, let's give it a try. I think in some ways we're still in some sort of experimental phase in some ways, but now that deals are entering their second or third deal term, the questions are changing, and that's something that we're thinking about a lot more and preparing a lot more than we used to. So questions about where this is all taking us, what is the next phase, whether TAs are actually transforming journals to open access. And then thinking about the challenging budget environment for many libraries, we're also seeing more pressure to deliver on data. So that's another kind of growing area of investment for us, thinking about how we can support showing that there is a positive impact on funding open for libraries, supporting that question of return on investment. That's another area we're really starting to think about more and more. Another thing we're focusing on is cost transparency. In the last few years, we've really seen a growing demand for more transparency on the part of publishers in this transition, and we think becoming more transparent as part of this transition is a really important part of what comes next in the future. Earlier today, you might have attended a session with my colleague Monica Weston about our recently released research paper about the future of publishing. I just wanted to share one stat from that report. We surveyed authors, librarians, funders, and publishers around the world, and 86% of people supported the idea of research being more open, but only 32% agreed that the existing system is in a good position to meet future challenges. So I think that just reinforces the sense that not everything is figured out yet, but sort of hanging in there during this period despite budget challenges in a complex environment is going to be a major part of kind of what the next few years look like.
Thank you. Value is always on the table, and it may be more critical today. How do we, from our different perspectives, evaluate open access agreements and frame return on investment on the read side and on the publish side? How do we measure uptake, impact, and outcomes for an institution, a consortium, a publisher? Kelly, how does Cambridge University Press address different balances of read versus publish institutions when working with a consortium or a system like the University of California? How do you measure and report value for your customers?
So we have a really diverse mix of institution types that are now participating in the Cambridge TA. That's been really important for us, that the TA is accessible to all institution types and not just an opportunity for research-heavy institutions. And so in thinking about the kind of TA value proposition across such a diverse group, you really need to think about clearly distinguishing different types of value, right? Like being able to sort of look at read value exclusively versus publish value and the sort of combined sense of value as well. So for published, we look at average research publishing across a 3-year period, and then we look at what we call the OA success rate, so OA uptake from authors against that average publishing. We also look at the total sort of financial value of average publishing as well. And then for Read, Read is going to continue to be a significant part of the Cambridge TA into the future. So Read value metrics that were in place before are still applicable. So metrics like usage and cost per use are still kind of part of the conversation at this point in time. We also share things like list price value of the full collection, as well as information about new titles and title flips. Part of the Read value we haven't talked as much about yet, though, is support for and access to non-research content. So about a quarter of our annual output is non-research content. One example of what that is something like book reviews. And non-research content is disproportionately in the humanities and social sciences, disproportionately paywalled, and despite that, very important to the communities that they serve. So that's another part of sort of talking about Read value that we need to kind of get better about communicating and talking about in the future as well.
Thank you. Amy, how does OhioLink balance its Read members and its published members when assessing value? How do you measure and report impact for the consortium?
So we do consider maybe 2 definitions for value for our members. So if we have institutions that have a high publishing output and are have the opportunity to publish an OA, we're really looking at, are they producing content and taking advantage of that OA deal, but also what does their subscription usage look like? For our other institutions, what we do need to see value out of is that use of subscription content. We don't look at our non-publishing institutions' open usage. We do, but we really don't think about that and take that into account because technically there's no value there, that we don't need to be paying for that. So looking very closely at that, and when, we haven't hit that yet, but when my community colleges or smaller institutions aren't seeing a lot of use coming out of the subscription side, then we have to start thinking really hard about what our cost allocation looks like, because that value proposition for them has shifted. There's quote unquote less value there. So we are looking at all of those things combined.
Thank you. Matthew, how does CDL measure value, uptake, impact, and outcomes of its agreements? What are you paying particular attention to?
Yeah, this is kind of a huge question, and I had a talk earlier today that looked at some of this, right? At UC, we have a couple of key metrics that we track within most of our agreements that tell us how we're doing, especially on the published side, and that's where I think we focus a lot of our attention because we're a high output institution. One is uptake of the open access option. We really want to maximize this because it represents the key outcome we're aiming for, right? Shifting our research outputs to be more open. And I think it's worth drawing a distinction between that and pure volume of publishing here, because while volume is often a consideration in the price of an agreement, it's less critical for evaluation for that transformative piece, right? We try to be largely agnostic to raw volume metrics in the interest of supporting all of our authors wherever they want to publish. And so when we're thinking about how well we're transforming things, uptake ends up being the better value-based measure for that. The other metric is what we call grant participation, which is a bit specific to our agreements because we have a model where we ask our authors to contribute towards the cost of publication if they have research funds available, but where the cost is fully covered if the author isn't able to contribute anything. And so this metric largely goes towards sustainability from our perspective. We're able to build a model with financial parameters that we can manage moving forward. So that's sort of the metrics piece of it, but of course that gets translated into a couple of bigger picture questions, right? What's the overall financial picture with the publisher and how has it evolved? What's the investment from libraries? What's the investment from authors? What would it be if we had stayed on the subscription model? What would it be if those key parameters varied in an unexpected way, which we think might happen in the next couple of years? What's the overall investment per published unit with the publisher, either all articles or just articles made open access, right? And admittedly, this is an imperfect measure because the article as a unit is somewhat imperfect and varied, right? Exactly what Kelly was just talking about with the book reviews. That's a challenge, right? But it's a useful benchmark to take into account sort of overall volume and expenditure within an agreement. And then a big piece has to do with the publisher themselves. Is there a transition happening there for the publisher that we're participating in? Is there an acknowledgement of our authors' rights in their own work and ability to do what they expect to or are required to do with their research? Is there sufficient quality control? Right, so maybe putting that briefly, is this a publisher that we want to continue working with? This is certainly a bit fuzzier, but we're fortunate at UC to have some deep faculty engagement to help us assess that more subjective space.
Thank you. So how do libraries, consortia, and publishers approach potential renewals of read and publish agreements? What have we collectively learned, and how do those lessons affect negotiations for the next agreement? What's the tipping point for renewal or walking away? The OhioLink Consortium recently negotiated a renewal of their read and publish agreement with Cambridge University Press for an additional 3 years. It was a renegotiation and not a continuation of the previous terms. Amy, can you talk about how OhioLink leverages return on investment assessment when negotiating renewals or potential renewals of agreements? When you walk away from the table or decide to not even sit at a table, are there factors in common that drive your no?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're seeing a decline in subscription-based content, that for us right away means that we need to start talking about a lower price. Again, because I don't have a ton, very different than Matthew, right? You have a lot of institutions with a lot of output. I don't have that. So we kind of put our institutions in 3 buckets. So Ohio State kind of lives in their own bucket, and then we have Case Western, University of Cincinnati, and the Cleveland Clinic is a member of OhioLink. We can talk about that later. In the second bucket, and then the third bucket is the rest of my members, and there's a ton of our 2s, there's a ton of our 3s that have a lot of output, and then there's some output coming out from independent or private colleges. So when we see subscription output lower, I know, again, as Matthew said, I know that journal article as a unit can be a little fuzzy, but I'm not producing enough content from my publisher, my institutions that are publishing, to allow for us to keep that pricing the same. So they're difficult conversations talking about value when you're looking at subscription content in conjunction with value for the cost of producing something open.
Thank you. Kelly, from the perspective of a large university press, how do you approach assessing and framing the success of your read and publish agreements when proposing renewals, both success for the press and your library and consortia partners?
So when working with libraries on negotiations for TAs, I think I've already mentioned the kind of reporting we look at to establish success metrics, so that OA success rate for publishing, usage and list price value for read. Those are all going to continue to be really important. I think the numbers need to stack up, and the value and the kind of return on investment needs to be really clear for all institution types. I do want to talk a little bit more, though, about some of the maybe fuzzier aspects that Matt just mentioned around kind of less concrete but kind of equally important ways we're thinking about success in TAs and success for us. So things like services, like is it easy for authors to take advantage of OA funding, or authors having a relatively smooth experience? Is it simple and accessible for libraries to manage the TA? Are we providing good service? These are things that might not come up unless they're going wrong, frankly. So hopefully they don't come up, but they are important to consider when thinking about kind of how things are going. Thinking about kind of article accounts and looking at the transition by article versus by journal and by list that Amy just talked through a little bit. I think our sense of success is also very much tied to the kind of bigger picture across the full Cambridge list sense of success in this transition. So thinking about overall, is this working across all of our titles, across disciplines, across our many society partners, and thinking about the context that each journal kind of exists within. So the classic example would be a kind of humanities journal with a lot of that non-research content I mentioned before, and not as much research output. I think we need to consider, when we're thinking about success from the Cambridge perspective, is this working across the list holistically? How is the kind of value stacking up from that angle of things? And are we communicating with libraries about that as well effectively and all of that? So yeah, I think the final point I wanted to make was around another kind of maybe fuzzier area, but around equity and making sure that models are equitable. We are hearing more and more from libraries and from consortia about kind of really being able to kind of understand whether the model they're participating in is supporting an equitable transition for authors around the world as well. So that's another factor that's come up more and more.
Thank you. The Ohio State University Libraries has declined to enter into read and publish agreements with terms or publisher philosophies that are too far removed from our principles and expectations of quality and value. This has mitigated sticky situations that might have occurred with potential renewals. Matthew, how are CDL's guiding principles activated when considering whether to renew a read and publish agreement? What are your negotiating red line issues? How do your agreements move the needle on the University of California system's expectations of the library?
Yeah, I'd say we really look at a couple different aspects of sustainability. A big one is whether the costs are sustainable, especially if there are moving parts within the agreement that could cause library costs to increase during the contract. We've now had a couple of agreements where certain publishing-based outcomes caused our future costs to increase unsustainably. And we actually had to exit those agreements, although in both cases we did that early at a predetermined trigger point rather than at renewal time. But it was unfortunate because we put a lot of work into developing those agreements, but it's a part of testing out a new agreement space, right? Not everything is going to work, and you need to be able to acknowledge when you have to find a different approach. And then, like I mentioned before, we also look at alignment on some key issues. Author rights is a big one. Other terms within a license, like AI, text and data mining license language, that allows our researchers to do what they expect to do or are already doing as a part of their research is another important one. And now how a publisher is managing the U.S. federal funder requirements. In many cases, these all have the potential to be red line issues because they all have the potential to diminish the value of our investment with the publisher. So in terms of how our agreements move the needle on UC's expectations, I can think of two ways, right? So first is focusing on these key author-facing issues. It means that we're developing an expectation among faculty that we can negotiate with these publishers on behalf of the faculty's values, and that's really important. And then second, like I said at the start, right, more than half of UC's articles are now eligible to be made open access under one of these agreements. So it's the case that more often than not, when a UC author publishes an article, they're being asked to make it open access with support from one of these agreements. And so I think that largely means that authors are going to start thinking of open publishing as a part of the research process and expecting support from the library to do that.
Thank you. To wrap up our panel, if you had an elevator speech for read and publish agreement advice, what is the one thing you would share for others to consider when approaching a potential renewal of a read and publish agreement? Do you want to start with Kelly?
So this is kind of broad, but I think we're at that 50% point for open access for research globally across publishers. But I think it's clear that there isn't really one type of model that's going to work or that is working right now. There's not one solution or answer that everyone's sort of on the same page about. We don't know everything yet, so I do think this is a really good time to keep asking questions. Models are still being shaped. I think librarians and consortia really have an opportunity to continue shaping those. So that would be my kind of call out to just really engage with publishers on all of this and keep the conversation going.
Amy, if we were stuck in an elevator, what would be your speech?
We have a saying in OhioLink called the art of the possible, and that kind of keeps us from trying to make decisions based on very black and white information. So, it's the art of negotiating, the art of being able to give a little, take a little, and work with our publisher partners. So it is a dance and it is a partnership. I'm not expecting, Kelly to give me all of the things for free, and Kelly's not expecting me to pay over what makes reasonable sense based on our usage and our publishing output. One thing I do want to go back to and talk about is the idea of saturation point, right? Because it's something we've been thinking about a lot at OhioLink. And with the shifting or the loss of federal funding for many of my institutions, my saturation point is relative, right? So now I'm not sure what's going to happen next year because I don't know how much money my institutions are getting from funders. So I think for me, my lesson learned recently is I need to make sure I'm keeping my finger on how much money my institutions are getting to try to get to that, well, gosh, what do I think our saturation point might be?
Thank you. Matthew?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd stress is the importance of stakeholder engagement and alignment. When in doubt on a topic and considering renewals, consult the relevant groups, especially faculty and researchers, because everybody's going to have their own nuanced perspective on the agreement, and that can help you evaluate your pathway forward. And I think that's also important because in the question you're asking about a potential renewal, right? The alternative to renewing is reverting to a subscription model, which means removing open access support. So that removes a service from authors. Or the other alternative would be canceling altogether, right? If that's the pathway you're going to take, you're going to need the support and buy-in of all of those stakeholder groups. So consulting with them early and helping them feel engaged is really important.
Thank you, Kelly, Amy, and Matthew. We'll now open it up for questions from the audience. We do have a microphone, so wait for the microphone to come over, and a reminder to state your name and your affiliation. Thank you.
Hi, Robin from ISU. Matt, you just talked about if the decision is made to not renew, you can, you give up the APC payments and keep the subscription, or you give up the whole thing. What about just getting rid or reducing the subscription? This may be more of a question for Kelly. Is it possible to have the ability to pay for the publishing across the portfolio of your journals, but only subscribe to the read content you really use instead of your whole journal package?
I think how we've approached this, I think what I was alluding to earlier around this kind of our sense of having to look at the list holistically because of how diverse the content is, the disciplines are, that I don't know when, but a long time ago, we kind of made the decision to have a kind of all-in approach to ensure that we're able to make this work. So it's not something we've done, and I think kind of looking at that overall sustainability is going to continue to be really important. So yeah, that's kind of my knee-jerk reaction, that I think we're going to need to kind of keep looking at the list as a whole in this transition.
I think hybrid journals would kind of make that really, really hard to calculate too, right? Like, my brain just hurt thinking about that.
Yeah, we actually have one agreement where we did reduce our read portfolio as a sort of piece of moving into that transformative agreement. But it's a strange message for our authors now, right? They can't read content in that journal, but they do have support to publish there if they want to, right? So how do you talk about that, right? I mean, that was a pretty extensive exercise in assessing the value of those journals that we no longer have access to from the perspective of sort of read value, and determining that wasn't worth the same investment that it had been previously. But yeah, I mean, that's a consideration, but you're right to I think point that question to Kelly first, right? Because you need a partner on the publisher side to work with you to manage that as well.